Our narrative begins in the 18th century, when Alaska was first colonized by Russian explorers and traders. But it had been a long trip from Moscow to Asia's Pacific coast in the first place. Russian expansion into Asia began in earnest in the 1600s. These early Russian explorers, called promyshleniki, meaning your orphan, were merchants and fur trappers who helped Russia expand eastward across Eurasia. Seeking pelts, particularly sable, they could sell in Europe and China. As these Russians met the nomadic people of Central Asia and Siberia, they would sometimes trade with them for furs, but often they would simply demand tribute or take hostages, demanding furs and pelts be paid as a ransom, in a pattern that would be repeated with the natives of Alaska. In Russia, the promyshleniki were sometimes identified with the Cossacks, semi-nomadic people from the Carpathian Mountains. These frontiersmen were allowed a great deal of autonomy in return for providing military service when called upon. Indeed, there could be little oversight in such a vast and forbidding environment. A common saying went, "God is in his heaven, and the Tsar is far away." The Russian march across Eurasia was slow and arduous. They established ostrogs, or trading posts, where trade could be conducted and agents could levy a 10% tax. But expansion accelerated under Tsar Peter the Great, who was determined to bring Russia up to speed with the great European powers of the day, finally reaching eastern Siberia in the 1690s. As much as the economic benefits of an empire, Russia wanted the prestige of colonies that they saw in the great powers of Western Europe. And what better place to look than to the east? Having expanded across Eurasia, it only made sense for the Russians that they should have a go at the Americas, where other European powers had found such success. Sailing for the Russians, a Danish captain named Vitus Bering explored Alaska's coast in 1728, but it wasn't until 1741 that Bering returned to make landfall. His ship, the St. Gabriel, landed off the coast of Alaska on a small island now named for him. But he wouldn't have much time to celebrate his new island, since soon after landing, Captain Bering and much of his crew died of scurvy and a host of other health problems. But the survivors of Bering's expedition brought back some 800 otter pelts to Russia, which soon became more valuable than sable. The Aleutian Islands are surprisingly mild, and the seas surrounding them teemed with life, and fortune hunters soon began to pour across the Bering Sea and into the Aleutian Islands in search of pelts. The natives of the Aleutian Islands, called the Aleuts, depended on the sea for food. They had invented the kayak and were skilled hunters of otters and seals. The name Alaska is actually thought to come from the Aleut language, but like so many indigenous people of the Americas, the Aleuts were unprepared for European disease. It is estimated that 80% of the Aleutian population died in the first generations of Russian colonization, from 10,000 in 1741 to only 2,000 by 1800. The Russians saw that the Aleuts were expert hunters, and they continued the pattern established in Siberia, holding natives hostage in return for ransoms paid in furs and pelts. The Russians demanded hunting far beyond what the environment could sustain, which devastated these animals' populations. When the Russians did offer goods in trade, it was liquor and firearms, in addition to the measles and smallpox they had already given, free of charge. A merchant named Grigory Shelikov saw the potential for a trading company similar to the British East India Company. In 1784, the newly founded Russian-American Company established its first permanent settlement on Kodiak Island. Eventually, the Russian-American Company was granted a monopoly on all hunting, trading, and mining in the area. In the 1790s, the company ended the system of hostage-taking, replacing it with something that really wasn't any better. Instead of being taken as hostages, all Aleutian men aged 18 to 50 were conscripted to become hunters for the company, whose officials were encouraged to marry indigenous women, spawning a significant Creole population with a foot in both worlds. But Russian America would not be confined to the Aleutian Islands. They established a base on the mainland in 1799, calling it the Fort of Archangel Michael, on what we would today call Alaska's Panhandle. A few years later, the fort was attacked by warriors of the Tlingit, whose decorative arts, including totem poles, are immediately recognizable as icons of the American Northwest, and the company was forced to pay a ransom for the survivors. The Tlingit held Fort Archangel for more than a year before a fleet arrived from the Russian motherland that bombarded the Tlingit into submission. And today this is known as the Battle of Sitka, after the indigenous name for the area. Sitka became the capital of Russian America, with its own cathedral and bishop of the Russian Orthodox Church. The Russian America Company dreamed of making the Pacific into a Russian lake. With so much autonomy, its leaders tried setting up outposts in Northern California and even the Sandwich Islands, better known today as Hawaii. Although Russia claimed nearly the entire modern state of Alaska, it penetrated very little into the interior. At the time of Alaska's sale to the United States, only 1,000 Russians were living in the territory, plus another 2,000 people identified as Creoles. since they never reached much further inland. The Russians had little contact with another of Alaska's native people, the Athabascans, hunters of moose and caribou. But, being far from Moscow, Russian America received a supply ship from the motherland only once every 2 or 3 years. So the colony quickly became dependent on trade with other European settlers, particularly Americans, who saw the potential riches swimming off Alaska's shores. Merchants in Boston and New York started sending expeditions to Alaska to acquire otter furs, which they would later take to Canton, the great Chinese trading post of the day. Soon the merchants were conducting a kind of triangular trade between New England, Alaska, and China. New England merchants were particularly interested in whaling, bringing back whale oil and baleen for various Victorian household goods, including using the oil for lamps and weaving the baleen into baskets and fishing lines. This use of American merchants as an entry to the Chinese markets was crucial to the Russian America Company because Russian merchants were banned from Chinese ports, who saw no need to enrich their great neighbor to the north. But while the colonists in Alaska were relying heavily on American supplies, officials were concerned about Americans supplying natives with firearms and ammunition, and Moscow asked the United States to ban the practice, but the federal government declined to intervene. In April 1824, the US and Russia hashed out their differences with a treaty that placed the southern boundary of Russian Alaska at 54 degrees latitude and allowed both nations to trade with the natives, alcohol, and firearms accepted. 1853 saw the outbreak of the Crimean War, in which Great Britain and France teamed up to defend the Ottoman Empire after a Russian invasion. It was a decisive defeat for Russia, and one that demonstrated that the country still lagged behind the great powers it was trying to emulate. In the midst of the Crimean War, Tsar Alexander II ascended to the Russian throne in 1855. He would ultimately become a transformative figure in the country's history, known for his extensive liberal reforms. Following its defeat in the Crimean War, which concluded in 1856, Russia was compelled to redirect its attention toward Europe. Its previous endeavors in North America had yielded minimal economic benefits, with diminishing returns on investments in the region. One stark example of this decline was the precipitous decrease in the sea otter population. It is estimated that in the early 19th century, approximately 300,000 sea otters inhabited the coastal waters of the North Pacific. However, by the mid-1800s, their numbers had plummeted to a mere few thousand due to overhunting. Consequently, Russia's diminished prospects in North America prompted a strategic realignment, emphasizing the need for engagement and diplomacy within the European sphere. Alexander's advisors started toying with the idea of selling Alaska. Faced with the potential of losing Alaska without any recompense, the idea of selling the territory appeared increasingly attractive. The sale has loomed in the Russian imagination as well. During the Soviet era, some teachers taught that Alaska was an example of the hubris of the monarchy, expanding beyond its ability to govern. Other teachers told students that there was no sale at all, that according to a technicality of the treaty, Alaska had merely been leased to the United States for 100 years, similar to Great Britain's century-long lease of Hong Kong. With relations between Russia and the US turning worse in the 2010s, some Russian politicians landed on Alaska as a point of contention, looking for errors in the original treaty language that would nullify the sale, or threatening to seize Alaska in retribution for sanctions levied by the US, although even the Moscow Times has called these overtures generally facetious.